Welcome everybody to the De Morgan Foundation's talk on the art of Frederic George Stevens, the forgotten Pre-Raphaelite, until tonight perhaps, with my esteemed guest, Dr Robert Wilkes. Robert's just finished his PhD at Oxford Brookes University and is now an independent art historian. His PhD was on the work of Frederic George Stevens, and we're delighted to have him here tonight to tell us a little bit more and hope that from now on he's as well remembered as the rest of them. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you very much. Am I good to go? Can you hear and see me all right? And you can see the screen, that's good. I'll begin then. But a huge thank you to Sarah and the De Morgan Foundation for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you to everyone for tuning in to watch it as well. So this talk is based on research done for my PhD at Oxford Brookes, as Sarah said. My PhD sought to re-examine the art and writings of Frederic George Stevens, an original member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood who had been largely overlooked, even by dedicated scholars of Pre-Raphaelite and Victorian art. Although Stevens is best known for his art criticism, he began his career as an art student at the Royal Academy in London in the 1840s. In the 1850s, his careers as both an artist and a published writer overlapped as he struggled to earn a living and make a name for himself in the Victorian art world. Only a handful of his paintings and drawings survive, although, as this talk will hopefully demonstrate, he was rather more productive as an artist than has previously been recognised. This talk will consider his place as an artist within the context of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and offer new readings of his frequently neglected pictures. I will show a range of different works, literary subjects, portraits, and a modern life subject in roughly chronological order, and hoping to show developments within his work. And it will also present paintings and drawings by Stevens, which I discovered during my PhD research and which haven't really been seen before. So Stevens, if you've heard of him before, you'll usually know him mainly for his writings about Pre-Raphaelite art, written from his perspective as someone who is intimately involved with the movement from its earliest days. Notable texts by him include his early essays in the Brotherhood's magazine The Germ in 1850, his series of articles, The Two Pre-Raphaelitisms, published in the American journal The Crayon in 1856-57, and his monograph on Rossetti, published in 1894. I'm showing you the excerpts from that here. For 40 years, from 1860 until about 1900, Stevens was the chief art critic for the Athenaeum, an important weekly periodical on science, literature, and the arts. He wrote reviews of the major London art exhibitions, and his commentaries on the Royal Academy's summer exhibitions in particular are frequently quoted by scholars of Victorian art. The obituaries written for him after his death in 1907 all noted his importance as an art critic, although his verbose writing style and sometimes fiery critical opinions tended to divide opinion. Although, from about 1860 onwards, Stevens's career was devoted to his writing, his origins as a practicing artist continued to be important to him. And one of the things I did during my PhD was I went through the census records to see what he referred to himself as. And I found that from long after the time when he is supposed to have abandoned his painting, he still described himself as variously an artist, painter, and author in 1871, that's at the bottom of the screen there, an author and painter in 1881, and an artist and author in 1891 and 1901. And indeed, the official record for his death in March 1907 also gives his occupation as jointly artist and author. Clearly, his early forays into art making in the 1850s meant a great deal to him, and even if he no longer practiced art professionally, he was proud of his artistic beginnings. Study of his artworks, however, is slightly hampered by the fact that he left behind nothing in the way of a memoir or autobiography, and he even destroyed his diaries shortly before his death. One of his few autobiographical remarks actually comes from his 1894 monograph on Rossetti, in which he remarked in a footnote, having been stringently trained in the practice of art, I found the experience thus won to be of great value in the profession of an art critic, into which gentle craft I gradually drifted, and so remain. So for him, there was this important correlation between the two disciplines, in that he was a practicing artist who could also write art criticism. Art historians in the 20th century were not kind to Stevens's artworks. His paintings were often described as stilted, awkward, and technically inept, and Stevens himself was considered lacking in talent, a kind of lazy pupil of Holman Hunt's. And when I began researching my PhD in 2016, I quickly discovered that virtually nothing had been written about his artworks, at least when compared with the other Pre-Raphaelite brothers, particularly Millet, Hunt, and Rossetti. He's therefore, I think, something of an underdog in the pantheon of Pre-Raphaelite artists. But if we take the time to look carefully at Stevens's surviving paintings and drawings, we can see that there is more to them than initially meets the eye. They are more rewarding as Pre-Raphaelite pictures than previous scholars have given the artist credit for. While it could be said that Stevens was not of the same artistic calibre as, say, the prodigious Millet or the visionary Rossetti, does this automatically mean that his artworks are any less valuable as Pre-Raphaelite art objects? Artworks which adhered, after all, to the Pre-Raphaelite stringent principles of truth to nature. I think Stevens can be compared with the likes of Elizabeth Siddal, Walter Howell Deverill, and Charles Alston Collins, so-called marginal figures in the Pre-Raphaelite circle who still made important contributions to the development of Pre-Raphaelitism. But just to give you some brief biographical information about him, he was born in the area of Cornhill in London on the 10th of October 1827, the eldest son of Septimus Stevens and Anne Cook. In about 1830, his mother died, and his father Septimus married a woman named Dorothy Mary Farmer. You'll be seeing her later in this talk. The Stevenses were a large family. Frederic had 5 siblings. In 1837, when he was 9 or 10 years old, he suffered an accident which left him with a lifelong limp. Unfortunately, I still have not been able to discover the details of this particular accident, something of a mystery. He was educated partly at University College School and partly by a private tutor after the aforementioned accident. In 1843, he took lessons at the British Museum Drawing School, where he met William Holman Hunt for the first time. On the 14th of July, 1843, he enrolled in the Royal Academy Schools as a probationer, before becoming a full-time student on the 13th of January, 1844. On both of these occasions, he was recommended by Sir William Ross, a portrait painter and Royal Academician who lived near the Stevenses in Fitzroy Square, although it's still unclear exactly how Sir William Ross knew the Stevens family. Stevens applied himself fervently in his artistic studies at the Academy. A number of register sheets recording the attendance of the students in the antique school at the Academy have survived. They're in the Royal Academy archive. They show that in 1844, from January until March, and then August until December, Stevens attended 132 classes. In 1845, he took 89 classes. 3 years later, of course, in 1848, he was enlisted by his friend Holman Hunt to join the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. In a letter to William Michael Rossetti in 1895, he reminisced about this occasion, and I quote, "It was Hunt who proposed to me to join the PRB, coming to my place the day after the society crystallized at Millet's in respect to the Campo Santo prints. A good deal of talk had gone between us before that time, and leading up vaguely to a contract or agreement, such as the society held to." But now to move on to his artworks. In 1848, a few months before the PRB was founded, Stevens made designs for a drawing illustrating a subject from Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, Pardoner's Tale in particular, illustrating the 3 young men encountering the mysterious old man. The finished drawing, which I'll show you in a second, is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, but I'm showing here a small sheet of sketches which I discovered during my PhD. They are Stephens's initial ideas for the Ashmolean drawing and are the earliest works by him to have survived, probably done in the summer of 1848 before he started the main drawing. And it's quite strange. The piece of paper that Stephens was using appears to be an order form for arranging the transportation of goods. So clearly he was using whatever materials he had to hand. But here on the right is the finished drawing by Stephens, which is now in the Ashmolean, and for which the sketches I discovered were a direct study. It's entitled Death and the Rioters, and is executed in the classic style of early Pre-Raphaelite drawing, with a strong emphasis on the linearity of forms and a kind of tense angularity in the figures. I'm showing you here some details of the drawing, partly to show off Stephens's very meticulous pen technique, but also showing this inscription at the bottom of the drawing, which says Dante Gabriel Rossetti from his Pre-Raphaelite brother FGS. So Stephens gifted the drawing as a gift to Rossetti in 1854. And interestingly, on the back of the drawing, there is a lengthy extract from the Pardoner's Tale by Chaucer, which Stephens copied out to show the episode that he is illustrating. And this is dated July the 5th, 1853. So he worked on the drawing for quite some time and eventually gave it to Rossetti, as I said. I should note that this drawing on the right will be included in the Ashmolean's forthcoming exhibition of Pre-Raphaelite drawings and watercolours. This has unfortunately been postponed because of the pandemic, but once it's reopened, you'll be able to see this rare drawing by Stephens on display. Do go and check it out. But moving on, the interest in medieval subjects continued with this striking and highly unfinished painting by Stephens, which is now entitled Mort Darfur. It's one of 4 oil paintings bequeathed to the Tate Gallery by Stephens's son Holman in 1932. As far as I can tell, this picture has never been publicly exhibited. It has the honour of being the first Pre-Raphaelite depiction of an Arthurian subject and the first Pre-Raphaelite illustration of a poem by Tennyson, the poem Mort Darfur, and it shows Sir Bedivere bearing up the dying King Arthur to carry him down to the lake, where the boat is waiting to take him to Avalon. Stephens began the painting in 1849 and had plans to send it to the annual exhibition of the Liverpool Academy that year. However, as you can see, he ultimately abandoned it. I'm showing here some details from the painting, just again to show the fineness of Stephens's technique. I particularly like the detail on the left of Sir Bedivere raising his arm and his chainmail sleeve is slipping down. It's this really nice naturalistic detail, and the hands as well are very finely painted. I'm also showing you in the top right corner the initials PRB, which Stephens wrote in the corner of the panel, which suggests to me that if he had been able to finish the painting, he may have included it among some of the other Pre-Raphaelite paintings that were exhibited with the initials PRB in 1849, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Now, I mentioned that the painting illustrates Tennyson's poem Mort Darfur, which had been published a few years earlier. And in the collection of the Colonel Stephens Railway Museum in Tenterden in Kent, I found a sheet of paper on which Stephens copied out several extracts from Tennyson's poem. That's here in ink on the right-hand side of the sheet, including the relevant lines, "Sir Bedivere then took with care, and kneeling on one knee, o'er both his shoulders drew the languid hands, and rising bore him to the place of tombs." So this is the exact moment that Stephens is illustrating in his painting. He was clearly preoccupied with the Arthurian legends at this time. On the same sheet, on the left-hand side of the sheet in pencil, he wrote a list of authorities relative to King Arthur, noting down medieval manuscripts, Arthurian romances, and antiquarian texts. And at the same time as painting his Mort Darfur picture, he also wrote a poem, a projected epic inspired by the Arthurian legends. The poem, long thought to have been lost, came to light during my PhD research. I'm showing here a fragment of part of the poem. A bit of self-promotion. If you're interested in this subject about Stephens's Arthurian painting and poem, I advise you to check out the recently published book, Defining Pre-Raphaelite Poetics, edited so wonderfully by Heather Bozant-Witcher and Amy Carmen Huseby, which contains the full text of Stephens's Arthur poem in print for the first time, and an essay by me about this text. It's a very good book, and I believe they'll be giving a talk about it for the De Morgan Foundation in future. But to return to Stephens's painting, it shows the clear influence of Holman Hunt's Rienzi vowing to obtain justice for his brother's death, shown here on the right, which had been exhibited at the Royal Academy earlier in 1849. Hunt had actually painted part of this picture in the garden of Stephens's home in Lambeth in the summer of 1848. Both paintings present male figures in medieval armour out in the open air, caught in a moment of crisis. And I think the similarities become even clearer by comparing these two details. The figure of the knight dressed in red on the far left of Hunt's painting is clearly mirrored, I think, in the figure of King Arthur in Stephens's painting. Even down to the slit in his tunic where you can see his knee poking through. There's a clear symmetry there. But having abandoned his Arthurian painting, Stephens again looked to Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales for inspiration for his next oil painting, now entitled The Proposal, and also in the Tate. It remains the only fully finished original painting by Stephens to have survived. He began it in February 1850 and worked on it intermittently until the spring of 1851. The cottage interior was painted in October 1850, while Stephens, Holman, Hunt and Rossetti were staying at Sevenoaks in Kent. While Hunt and Rossetti worked on their canvases outdoors in nearby Knoll Park, Stephens sat in the washroom of the house in Sevenoaks where they were lodging and painted everything that he saw in typical Pre-Raphaelite fashion. In a letter home to his stepmother, Dorothy, he wrote, "I paint in the washhouse and enjoy all the 8 winds and a prime through draught into the bargain," an indication that he had the back door of the house, which you can see in the background of the picture, standing open the whole time in order to reproduce the scene as faithfully as possible on his canvas. Must have been very cold. He submitted the finished painting to the 1851 Royal Academy exhibition, apparently under the false name of Brown, I'm not sure why, but it was rejected and remained in his possession. And the story it tells of patient Griselda and her unfortunate marriage to a monstrous nobleman was first recounted in the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron from the 14th century. It was retold by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales as the Clerk's Tale. I don't have time to recount the full story, but suffice it to say that Griselda is a poor young woman who lives with her father in a cottage when she catches the eye of a marquis named Walter, who has been looking for a wife. Their marriage is hardly rosy. Walter subjects her to a series of humiliating trials in order to test her faithfulness to him, hence the name Patient Griselda. And these ominous future events in the narrative are foreshadowed by the slightly comical chickens that are at Griselda's feet in the painting, the rooster raising his claw to subdue the cowering white hen. Stephens's painting shows the clear influence of Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini Portrait, a painting well known to have inspired the PRB. The finely painted interior, the central positioning of the couple, the joined hands in the centre of the composition, the light filtering through the window, and even the pose of Griselda herself are echoes of the Van Eyck. Stephens's Proposal was painted at exactly the same time as Millet's The Woodman's Daughter, a very well-known Pre-Raphaelite picture, from 1850 to 51. I posited in my thesis that Stephens conceived the proposal as a kind of thematic pendant piece to Millet's painting, which also foreshadows the cruel treatment of a working-class woman by a cold-hearted aristocratic man. In the case of Millet's painting, this is disturbingly enacted by two children. Millet's painting was based on the poem by Coventry Patmore, The Woodman's Daughter. In both paintings, too, the father of the female figure is complicit in their daughter's fate. They're both positioned in the margins of the canvas and appear to not really participate in what's about to happen to their children. There's also a very interesting comparison, I think, that can be made with Holman Hunt's very famous painting, The Awakening Conscience. Once again, you have the theme of a poor woman entrapped by a rich male suitor, but here transposed into a modern setting. One noticeable similarity between the two works is the use of animals who dramatize the situation of the human figures. Stephens used a rooster and a white hen, as I just showed, and Hunt a cat toying with a bird, and I've shown you here two details from the painting to show the similarities. I should say that Stephens's painting came first, so clearly maybe Hunt was borrowing ideas from him. In 1850, at the same time as painting the proposal, Stephens painted this copy of a portrait by Hans Holbein, which was another discovery made during my PhD. While it is not particularly successful as a copy, it is worth mentioning it in order to highlight Stephens's productivity and the different ways in which he earned money from his art. The project is recorded in William Michael Rossetti's PRB journal on the 2nd of February 1850. Millet has had an offer from Oxford to paint a copy of a portrait by Holbein, which, as he does not feel disposed to accept, he offered to Stephens, who will do it after the opening of the Royal Academy exhibition. The commission came from James Wyatt Jr., the son of James Wyatt, a framer based in Oxford, who was an early patron of Millet in the 1840s. New College, Oxford, wanted a copy of Holbein's portrait of a former Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, who was an alumnus of the college, and Stephens was eventually enlisted to do this. The original by Holbein is in the Louvre, shown on the left here, and there was a second copy of the painting in Lambeth Palace, the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury, shown here in the middle. And the Lambeth Palace copy in Stephens's day was still attributed to Holbein himself, so Stephens would have thought he was working from an actual Holbein. He visited Lambeth Palace on several occasions in the spring of 1850 in order to make studies for his copy, but the portrait was then hung in the private library of the then Archbishop John Bernard Sumner, which made it difficult to access. James Wyatt Jr. recommended that Stephens could also use this 18th century engraved reproduction by George Virtue as a reference in lieu of the original. And the use of Virtue's reproduction perhaps helps to explain further why Stephens's replica looks so unlike the picture in Lambeth Palace. He was already copying from a copy. Stephens sent the finished replica to James Wyatt Jr. in the summer of 1850, but as Stephens was later informed by Millet, Wyatt was dissatisfied with the picture and decided to have parts of it altered. The painting was eventually sold by Wyatt to New College in April 1851, and the receipt for the purchase is still in the college archives. And I should say here that I'm indebted to Mary Susan Duval's unpublished thesis on Stephens from 1988 for bringing these receipts to my attention. The discussion of the Holbein portrait is a nice segue into another aspect of Stephens's work which was entirely overlooked before I began researching it, and that's portraiture. Reading through Stephens's original correspondence, I found that he received numerous commissions for portraits in the early to mid-1850s. This was a reliable way for any young artist to earn extra money. Indeed, in a letter to Hunt in June 1854, Stephens declared that he had no less than 5 portraits in hand. This raises the intriguing possibility that there are more paintings by Stephens out there waiting to be rediscovered. But these 2 portraits that I'm showing you, which he painted of his stepmother Dorothy and his father Septimus, were the only works by Stephens to be exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1852 and 1854 respectively. The portrait of Dorothy in particular on the left exhibits a kind of daguerreotype clarity which we typically associate with early Pre-Raphaelite portraits. Stephens may well have been influenced by portraits by Millais and Hunt, in which the sitters are viewed frontally and close to the picture plane. Stephens's portrait evidently had a bold colour palette, as J.B. Manson described it in 1920. Dorothy is wearing a black dress and white cap with blue ribbons and an orange apron. A white cloth is in her lap, and in the background is green wallpaper, and to the right, a corner of the gold frame of a mirror. These paired combinations of red and green, blue and orange, and black and white, playing off against each other, must have been very striking, but it is impossible to discern this from the black and white photograph, which has been left to us. Stephens had already made this very delicate and finely finished sketch of Dorothy, shown here on the left, which is also in the Tate. It's dated 1850 by the Tate, but it could have been done a little bit later, perhaps in preparation for the oil portrait which Stephens exhibited at the Academy. And I'm also showing you here on the right a photograph of Dorothy, courtesy of the Colonel Stephens Railway Museum, done quite a few years later, so that you can compare how successful a likeness it is. And I should say that the baby on Dorothy's lap in the photograph is actually Stephens's son, Holman, who was born in October 1868. But I come now to the final artwork in this talk, which is probably Stephens's best known painting, and certainly the one about which most has been written. It's titled simply Mother and Child. Some of you may have seen it before, on display in Tate Britain currently, as it happens. It was part of the Stephens bequest to the Tate in 1932. Although the painting is not dated, it was probably begun in 1854, and Stephens may have worked on it intermittently for a couple of years. The painting was included in the Tate's famous Pre-Raphaelites exhibition in 1984, with a catalogue entry written by Robin Hamlin. It was Hamlin who first suggested that Stephens's painting, which depicts a young woman receiving a letter, was in fact a commentary on the Crimean War, which ran from 1854 to 56. Hamlin pointed to the toys on the bed, shown here in the detail on the left. A Russian hussar on horseback and a lion, presumably symbolic of Britain, straddled by a doll which distinctly resembles Queen Victoria. Certainly, Stephens took a great interest in the Crimean War, even going so far as to send Holman Hunt copies of the Times with reports of the various campaigns from the Crimea, and Hunt was abroad at this time. And in fact, in one instance, Stephens sent Hunt newspapers from the 6th to the 10th of March, I believe in 1854, containing an account of a fresh battle between Turks and Russians at Eupatoria, and also reports of the progress of the inquiry into the causes of the suffering of the army before Sebastopol, which excites the greatest interest here. We have seen Stephens becoming preoccupied with a particular subject before, when he was painting Mort Darfur in 1849, and he read all that Arthurian material. But this was not an antiquarian interest, but one that was closely connected with current affairs. There is some ambiguity in Stephens's picture, however, in that it's unclear whether the letter the woman has received, shown here on the right, brings news of her husband's death, or simply news prolonging his absence. And I wonder this because the letter paper that she's holding does not have a black border, which we would normally associate with mourning stationery. But perhaps that wasn't always the case in the Victorian period. A possible visual source for Stephens's painting is Millais' drawing Retribution, a detail of which is shown here on the right, which was also done in 1854. I think the pose of the mother in Stephens's painting is closely similar to the drawing of the figure of the mother sitting on the sofa in Millais' drawing, her left hand resting on the father's knee and her right hand lying in her lap. And you also have the figure of the daughter at her feet, who is reaching up towards her father. And this perhaps is echoed in the girl in Stevens's painting, who's reaching out towards her mother. Oh, and actually, I think I've got that wrong. It's actually the mother is the one that's kneeling on the floor in the Millet drawing. Is what I digress. The model for the young mother in Stevens's painting could have been Annie Miller, and so there's a point which I made in an article in the Pre-Raphaelite Society review in 2018. There is some evidence for this within the painting itself. Annie Miller's name is actually inscribed in Stevens's hand in the upper right spandrel of the canvas under the frame, and I've shown it here in the bottom left corner circled in red. Hopefully you can see it. That's Annie Miller's name written in Stevens's hand. There are also the likenesses of Annie Miller made at around the same time in 1853 and 54, such as these three examples by Millet and Hunt. In all three pictures, Annie Miller is wearing the same bow and strings around her neck as the woman in Stevens's painting, and her hair is also fashioned in a similar way, although this may just have been the popular fashion of the time. But during a recent discussion on the Facebook group PRB Q&A, a couple of people also pointed to Emma Maddox Brown, née Hill, as an alternative. There is certainly a physical resemblance, and she frequently sat to other Pre-Raphaelite artists at this time. Despite having already argued that Miller was the model, Emma Maddox Brown is another viable candidate. So I've included it here to hopefully encourage further discussion. What does everyone think? Annie Miller or Emma Maddox Brown, or another person perhaps? But if Annie Miller was indeed the model for Stevens's mother and child, it would create a useful link with Hunt's The Awakening Conscience. Earlier I compared Stevens's The Proposal with The Awakening Conscience, but the similarities continue with Mother and Child, which similarly portrays a claustrophobic modern interior cluttered with gleaming Victorian furniture. The use of mirrors and confusing multiple reflections in both paintings is another distinctive point of comparison. Another painting which compares well with Stevens's is this one by Ford Madox Brown. It also depicts a young mother whose husband is apparently away fighting in the Crimea. Brown began his painting in 1851, but altered parts of it in 1854 to include references to the Crimean War, elevating it beyond a simple genre subject. The model, as it happens in Madox Brown's painting, is Emma Maddox Brown, so perhaps we can see other similarities there. The message in Brown's painting is clearer than in Stevens's. The love letters the woman has received from her absent husband lie on the table beside her, together with a portrait miniature. But Mother and Child is the latest painting, oil painting by Stevens to have survived. No other ones after that, after about 1856, are yet known to us. And just to conclude, I'm showing here a photo of the 1840 room in Tate Britain, showing the painting I've just shown you, Mother and Child, hanging directly above Millet's Ophelia. I believe it's still there, but I've not been there in a while. And maybe when lockdown is over, people could go and look at it. But I hope you've enjoyed this talk on F.G. Stevens's role as an artist within the Pre-Raphaelite circle. There is much more I could have said. And although his surviving body of work is smaller than any other Pre-Raphaelite artist, I believe, there is a lot to be discovered in these works, and they in fact cover a wide range of themes and influences that were popular with the PRB. Medievalism, English literature, Arthurian legends, portraiture, and modern life subjects. These works are very much the intense product of the friendships and connections Stevens had with his fellow Pre-Raphaelite brothers. And I would question, too, if they are really quite as bad as previous art historians have so hastily declared. Thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was an absolutely brilliant talk. I loved it. So enlightening, and to hear about an artist so closely associated with the ones that we hear about all the time, and yet we know so little about him has been a really wonderful thing to do of a Friday evening. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so let me put some of these to you. Who are the two models in the proposal, if you know, please?
Yes, maybe I could go back and show it so people can see. I know the name of the man sitting in the centre on the stool. This was a man named Bassett. Surname was Bassett, who is a young friend of Stevens's. And that's actually recorded in William Michael Rossetti's PRB journal. As for the woman who modelled for Griselda, that wasn't something I was able to find out. Robert Upstone, I think, in a book he published a few years ago, suggested Elizabeth Siddal, based on the hair and perhaps the facial expression. I'm not 100% sure. It could have been Elizabeth Siddal. She was certainly modelling for the other artists at this time, and actually the painting that Holman Hunt was working on during this same trip to Sevenoaks, which was the Two Gentlemen of Verona picture. Elizabeth Siddal does appear in that picture, which was done at the same time. So it's possible it could be her. But yeah, we don't know for certain.
Thank you. And one that I'm sure you get a lot is, do you have plans to write a book about Stevens?
Oh, yes, I would love to write a book. I do have plans to do so. Obviously, what I've shown you here was one aspect of my thesis. I also considered his writings as well, on his writings about the Pre-Raphaelites. So there's a lot of material there. But yes, I'm certainly considering it. It's just it would be my first book, so I know it would be a big project. But yeah, if there's interest as well, I think that would be really nice. But yes, I am like to work on a book.
Another slide, I think we're quite close to it, is the Mort Darfur painting.
Yeah.
Just to tell us why it looks like both of the figures are wearing masks in that painting, Robert, is suggested in the chat box.
Well, that was because the kneeling figure of Bedivere in the front, it appears as if Stevens didn't get round to actually painting the face at all. So it's just blank primer underneath the paint. The figure of Arthur behind him is intriguing because if you look very closely, you can see that Stevens has actually scrubbed out the lower half of the face. I thought this may be because in the poem, in this moment that Stevens is illustrating, Arthur is actually talking. He's commanding Bedivere to carry him to the lake. So perhaps Stevens was trying to get to grips with painting a face while it's in the midst of talking with the mouth open, and perhaps he found it difficult. So he decided to scrub out the lower half of the face. But he did leave the eyes and the rest of the face. So it does look a bit strange now. It's just so unfinished. But it's because it's either partially finished or he removed something that he had already done. That's why it looks a bit weird on the faces.
And a question that I'm pleased that Glenda has asked, because I was wondering this as well, is what's the connection with the Railway Museum in Kent? Is that a familiar connection?
Yes, I didn't have time to mention it. So that was, thank you for asking, Glenda. It was a discovery I made during the beginning of my PhD. So Stevens had a son who I mentioned in this talk, Holman Fred Stevens. It was his only child, who grew up to be a railway engineer. And he produced a number of light railways in the early 20th century, and he's quite a well-regarded figure in that respect. And there is this small museum in the town of Tenterden in Kent, which was set up in the 90s, I think, as in honor of his work. It's a very complicated story, but Holman Stevens died without any children, and his papers, his personal papers, passed to one of the executors of his will, who was not part of the family, and eventually they ended up in this railway museum. Half of this big collection of papers were given to the Bodleian in the 1950s. These are the F.G. Stevens papers in the Bodleian. But the other half was kept behind because they weren't considered important enough. And those are the papers that ended up in the Railway Museum. I happened upon them just a chance email to the curator of the museum, because I wondered if they might have some family artifacts or something related to Stevens. And it turns out they have this big collection of letters, poem manuscripts by Stevens. They have lots of photographs. They have other ephemera related to the Pre-Raphaelites, and no one had really found them before. So there are a lot of letters, original letters by Frederic George Stevens in that resource, and so I used those in my PhD. But there's a lot of material there, so I wasn't able to include nearly a fraction of it. But yeah, that's that story. There's a lot more material to go through there. It's a bit of I do get that question quite a bit. What's the Railway Museum all about? But yeah, that's the gist of it.
That's the joy of it. You never know where these things are going to show up.
Exactly, yes.
So a question about Stevens' patrons. Did he have any, or did he make his way without having patronage?
He didn't have any consistent patrons, unlike some of the others, like Millais, for example, had James Wyatt. Stevens didn't have any regular patrons. He just took commissions as he could get them. The portrait commissions are particularly interesting because he seems to have done quite a few of them at one time, and he in some of his letters he writes about wanting to take on more commissions for portraits so he could earn some money, because he was struggling financially. Something we can all relate to, I think. But he didn't. But those were sort of few and far between. He didn't have any official patrons in the way that Rossetti did, for example.
Great, thank you. And a question about the naming of his son. Obviously, it's quite an unusual name, and was that after William Holman Hunt?
It was after William Holman Hunt. There are some lovely letters between the two of them in which Stevens is trying to think of names to give his son, and he at one point wants to call him Holman Heliogabalus Stevens, after a Roman emperor, because he liked very strange polysyllabic names. But eventually he settled on Holman Fred Stevens, because William Holman Hunt was Holman's godfather. And Hunt and Stevens were very close friends until, as some people may know, they had a terrible falling out later in the 19th century, and they never spoke again to each other. Very, very dramatic.
Okay, quite a long one, so I'm going to read it out in full, so bear with me. With regard to the model in Mother and Child, could that have been sort of an idealised version of a person rather than based on an individual? And then sort of could that be linked to the clothing in Mother and Child and between Hunt's awakening conscience, because there's some resemblance there? And also, would that link at all to Millet's Mrs. Coventry Patmore? That's part one. And then part two is that whether there are any writings of Stevens that show he had a particular idea or ideal of femininity.
So with regards to the identity of the model and it perhaps being an idealized figure, I hadn't thought of that because Stephens clearly was following the very kind of fastidious truth to nature branch of Pre-Raphaelitism very closely, so I always assumed that he was using a real model. And indeed, when I saw Annie Miller's name in the corner, I wondered if perhaps it could have been her, and there was some resemblance as well. But on the other hand, it could be a more idealized figure. That's something I hadn't considered that. And the dress as well. Again, that's another interesting connection, and the attention that he has paid to this dress. I mean, it's hard to see on the screen, but in person, it's actually exquisitely painted. All the ruffles and the folds of her dress. He's lavished the same attention to it as Hunt did in The Awakening Conscience. And as for Stephens's own writings, I didn't come across anything where he specifically says about any kind of ideal female beauty that he is drawn to. But I have a feeling he would have wanted, given he wrote a lot about, he was particularly zealous about Pre-Raphaelite artists being painting very truthfully from nature, as some of the earlier artists did. So I would imagine that he would have wanted to try and paint, if he did use a real model, paint her as accurately as possible. But those are interesting points, actually, which I hadn't thought of. So thank you for bringing those up.
So I think that's more or less everything. So unless anybody has a question, I've also allowed you to unmute yourselves so that you can ask a question yourself if you prefer. Oh, was it Stephens who discovered Lizzie Siddal in The Milliners? I think maybe someone's been watching Desperate Romantics, but I'll let you answer that one, Robert.
Oh yes, Desperate Romantics. Yes, there is a character called Fred in Desperate Romantics who finds Miss Siddal in the hat shop. But if that story is true, there's plenty of suggestions that it wasn't true. But if it is true, evidently it was Walter Deverell, not Stephens. Stephens doesn't explicitly appear in Desperate Romantics. It's like a mishmash character of Stephens and William Michael Rossetti, and a bit of Deverell and a bit of Ford Madox Brown all squished together. Yeah, unfortunately, that was not him in the hat shop.
Fantastic show that is on YouTube in its entirety. If anybody isn't aware of that, I would highly recommend it, especially whilst you've got nothing else to do. Thank you, everybody, for coming along, and thank you so much to you, Robert, for entertaining and enlightening us on this fantastic artist whose work I think is really underappreciated. You know, it's such richly detailed, beautiful paintings, and I've really enjoyed seeing them. So thank you again.